Welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the world's largest online festival of ideas, now in its 5th year. This afternoon, we have a very special diff session for you. We're going to immerse ourselves into the theme of food. Firstly, we're going to look at some of the big challenges with a food system expert and a food business expert. But also, we're going to delve into the deliciousness of food with a world-class chef who's going to be creating something special as the session progresses. He'll be in the Diff Kitchen studio. We'll join him later. Now, I was contacted by the higher-ups of the Diff recently, and they said I'm not allowed to bamboozle the Diff audience with any stats or numbers. But I feel as though I just have to set the context of this Diff session just with 3 things. Food is the biggest impact that humans have on the environment. Each year, millions of hectares of land have to be abandoned because of the way we farm food. Also, the agricultural sector is the second largest emitter of carbon after the energy sector. Food is also the largest impact on human health. Poor diets have now overtaken alcohol and tobacco as the number one cause of diseases that leads to premature death. And at the same time, over 800 million people go to bed hungry every day. To make things even more complicated, the world population is set to grow by about 3 billion in the next 20, 30 years. So this is going to really create a challenge. So the question at the heart of this Diff session is, how are we going to feed the people of the world in a healthy way without destroying the planet? To help answer this question, a very complex question, we have in our attic studio Paul Newnham, director of the SDG2 Advocacy Hub, which brings together NGOs, agricultural networks, nutritionists, campaigners, and other stakeholders to try and achieve, amongst other things, zero hunger by 2030. Paul, welcome to the Diff.
Thank you.
And also, Andrew Stephen, head of the Sustainable Restaurants Association, an organisation established in the same year as the foundation, 2010, now with over 500 members spread out over 8,000 sites. We'll hear more about the Sustainable Restaurants Association later. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
Now, thinking too much of the challenges of the global food system can get a little depressing sometimes. So to remind us that there is joy and flavours and wonder in cooking, and in food. And remember, around the world, it's still food and feast is still the number one way to celebrate big occasions. Let's go down to the Diff Kitchen studio and see Vicky and Justin, and let's find out what's cooking down there.
Hi there.
Hi. So I'm Vicky from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and here we have Justin Horn, a world-famous eco-chef and restaurateur, here with us today. What are you cooking?
Well, we're keeping it seasonal today. We're cooking here with pumpkins, gourds and squashes. We have a variety of a few of them here today. These are all local from the island and all in season. And so I'm making a 3-course meal out of one of the larger squashes we had earlier. So we're going to have a starter made, which is a roasted pumpkin, sort of a hot, warm salad for sort of cold blustery day we have here today, followed by some pumpkin gnocchi, and then to finish a pumpkin mousse.
Amazing. I'm really, really looking forward to trying all that stuff. Yeah. So, and I'm sure the guys in the studio are too. Unlucky you're not here in the kitchen with us, but we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. So back to the studio with you, Nick.
Thank you, Vicky and Justin. Yeah, so we will be returning to the kitchen later on in the Diff session. Our collective mouths are watering with expectation. But let's get some questions out. Paul, I mentioned earlier the SDG2. Can you tell me why, after a period of decline, hunger is on the rise again? And then can you touch on how your work with SDG2 Advocacy Hub aims to address this and cope with all the extra demand?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So just firstly, for those that are unaware of what the SDGs are. So the SDGs are a plan that was started by each government of the world and signed on to in 2015 to basically deal with 17 of the biggest issues that we face. And one of the goals there is Sustainable Development Goal 2, which really covers over the areas of agriculture, food and nutrition. And within that, there's a number of different competing elements. Hunger is one part of that, and so at the moment, one of the challenges, as you just mentioned, is hunger has been on the rise. So for many years, we've actually been declining the number of hungry people in our planet, until actually the last few years, where we've seen this increase. And part of the reason for that increase, it's always hard to know because data is a lag indicator. It's kind of telling us what happened a year ago. And so what we can tell is that the number of hungry people has gone up, and it's particularly due to two things. One is because of conflict. There's a number of parts of the world when conflict actually encompasses a place, it is very hard for people to be able to get access to the food that they need. It's hard for food systems to be able to function. And that's been made even worse through issues of climate shock. And so it's not often people think it's climate change, but it's actually the shocks that are coming because of climate change. And so they're coming more regularly and they're having a bigger effect. And so we're seeing more and more of these kinds of shocks affecting food systems. And they're affecting in different ways. They affect migration, people having to force and flee, which changes their access to food. They're forcing crop and obviously agriculture, growing cycles. And they're meaning that we're not being able to do that. One of the things people don't realize though is that we do grow enough food globally to feed everyone on the planet. So actually at the moment, our hunger issues are not so much about not having the ability to feed everyone. It's actually that food is not in the right places. So a lot of the issues are actually on the continent of Africa in terms of the number of hungry people, and also in Asia, but it is spread. Part of the reason why that's challenging is because we're not efficiently or effectively using the food that we do grow. And so there's a lot of waste. We all know about the issues of food waste, and Chef Justin will talk a little bit about that. He's got some really interesting ideas. But there's huge amounts of food being lost every year, and there's huge amounts of food being wasted in certain parts. And so it's a distribution problem. It's an inequality problem, our food system, in terms of hungry people. At the same time, people are eating the wrong things. So we also have, at the same time as this hunger number going up, we have obesity growing very quickly. And so there's 1 in 8 people now on the planet that are facing some form of obesity. And to me, that's a real challenge, because in some parts of the world, we're going from hunger in one generation to obesity as an issue. And so that shows a really broken food system. It means that part of the solution to feeding people also has to look at sustainability, and it has to look at this holistically. So we can't just say get calories into people. We also have to think about the calories, the types of ingredients that we're actually using. So one of the things the Sustainable Development Goal 2 Advocacy Hub, which was set up last year, is doing is supporting and working with partners in the different areas of this. And so we work with a number of different groups around this. What we're trying to do is help to create a narrative that ties some of these complex issues together. Because I think sometimes when you look at one issue, you can try and solve it, and then you create another issue. A friend of mine used to say it's like a global waterbed. You know those waterbeds you would jump on? And if I jump on this side, I'd pop Andrew out. Now I would solve this problem, but then maybe cause him to fall out of it. You know, it's these kinds of issues. We have to see interconnectedness, and that's something that's really critical. So the hub tries to do that. And one of the ways we've done that is by trying to also think about the actual food, which is the thing that we all enjoy. Like as soon as Justin and team in the kitchen started talking, we all probably the viewership went up. You know, people were like, hey, we're talking about food. I'm hungry. So we want to bring the conversation about sustainability to food. And we've worked with chefs to try and do that. And so we've helped create this thing called the Chef's Manifesto, which is a framework that basically interprets these complex goals into language that everyday chefs can understand. And then it has in it actions that people can actually engage in. And so this is something that you can find out more about at chefsmanifesto.com, but it basically is a framework for chefs.
Great, very interesting. Yeah, that's a very interesting point about that sort of jumping from hunger to obesity in just one generation, as you say, and I like the idea about thinking about it systemically, which is something we very much do in the foundation. And the shock thing, I'd like to come back to the shock thing later, because within shock you need resilience as well. And so, what are smallholders farmers doing to be more resilient against these inevitable shocks? But we'll come back to some of those later. Andrew, achieving food security is just one part of the challenge, but we need to do it in a way that does not destroy the planet, and hopefully create healthier, more prosperous human beings. Tell us how your organisation is approaching this.
Thanks, Nick. So, hey, welcome everyone. The Sustainable Restaurant Association exists to help the people that are serving the food that we eat out play their maximum potential role in fixing the food system. So, a little note on kind of why we focus on what we eat out. I think if you look at the kind of stats that you started this session with, Nick, about, I guess, the kind of macro planetary role of the food system in kind of driving deforestation, biodiversity loss, etc. You can take that down to just an individual level, and it's true to say also that you as an individual human, what you eat is your most fundamental engagement with the natural world. Your food choices are your A game in terms of the positive and minus negative impacts that you have on the planet personally. It's more fundamental than your choice of transport, whether you do or don't drive an electric car. And if you look at how what we eat and our food choices has been changing over the last few decades, and how we're all on this same global trend towards eating out and towards animal protein, that tells you a really important story. I think I've been encouraged, as you were, to go low on all the stats, but I think if you look at some of the data from people like Nielsen who collect this information, you know, back in the late 90s, sort of 2/3 of people that they surveyed globally said they either ate out never or less than once a month. We're now in a place where over half of the population they're serving are eating out more than once a week. It's no more so than in Asia, where you have 9% of people that are eating out daily. Economies such as Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand, Morocco are at the very upper index of that, where you get on average a quarter of people are eating out more than once a day. So what we eat out matters. And that means that if you run a food business that is serving people every day, what you do and the sort of quick little choices you make in the kind of scramble of your day-to-day opening up, serving and closing down have a huge impact. So I guess that's what we do. We work with food businesses of all kinds. They could be cafes and train stations. They could be high-end Michelin-star restaurants with white tablecloths. They could be the place you eat in your workplace. They could be the food you have for dinner in the local pub. Could be a cafe. And we work with those guys essentially to sort of talk about two big things. The first is, how can you do less bad in a way? So when you think about kind of operationally, how can you waste less food? How can you be more energy efficient? How can you put the right kit in? How can you, I guess, put the right staff practices in, be it training or contracts, to, I guess, chip away at the margins and be a kind of efficient food business. And there's a tremendous amount of operational impact that can achieve. The kind of variance between a kind of inefficient food business and an efficient one, even just getting in the upper quartile, not doing anything completely disruptive, can achieve huge things for the planet and huge things for human health. So I guess what we do is we try to make sure that one person's "I did that last week" isn't another person's impossible, and trying to find ways of collaborating for those businesses around kind of energy, water, waste. We do that through our framework. We have kind of 10 key areas, 10 things that we say a good restaurant will do, from, I guess, kind of valuing natural resources to reduce, reuse, recycle, to not wasting food, to serving more veg and better meat, to sourcing fish responsibly, serving local and seasonal food, supporting global farmers, feeding people well, treating staff well, and supporting the community. There are sort of 10 commandments without Moses that we kind of ask restaurants to kind of get involved with and work out what that means for them. I think the second very brief thing is that restaurants can do more than less bad operationally. Like chefs, as Paul touched on, have a real capacity to inspire. The food system follows what chefs do, and there's a trickle-down effect. You know, why are we all eating salted caramel, avocados, and pulled pork? It's because, I guess, on some level, some influential chefs start doing that, and then other people look to that and start copying. You know, one of the reasons there's so few fish in the sea is that kind of in the early 70s, some American chefs went over to Japan, saw sushi, brought it back to New York, and 40 years later it's in a Morrison's meal deal. So I think we have a tremendous opportunity for restaurants to do more than just less bad operationally, but to kind of influence and guide, and that's why we connect with Paul and the Chef's Manifesto work.
Yeah, great. I'd like to come back to some of your 10 commandments later. So I'm glad that you moved on from doing less bad. We were talking about difficulties in defining sustainability at different scales and sizes of restaurants earlier, and you used the word restorative. can you just remind us what you mean by restorative? Because I thought you had a really good definition of that.
Sure, thanks. I'll try not to disappoint. I guess we tried not to get too lost in the details on it, right? There's a lot to think about if you're running a food business. There's the people, there's the planet, there's the sourcing, there's the animal welfare, there's the carbon. I think what we try to hold in our heads and help food business owners with is that because you exist as a business, there's a piece of land where your food's grown that's in a better place than it would have been if your business didn't open that morning. And there's people all along the value chain that are in a kind of healthier, more secure place because you open your door that morning. And that's a kind of big thing to do and unpack, but that's our kind of destination that we try to help food service businesses, I guess, set the level of ambition correctly around what we mean by sustainable restaurant.
Can I just remind the audience that you can post questions to Justin or Paul or Andrew by just typing them directly into the session page or using the Twitter handle ThinkDiff. Both of you, so I've looked at your 10 Commandments, I've looked at your Chef's Manifesto. Both of you mentioned the concept of local. I think this is quite a sort of a nuanced issue. So could we, I was reading a book by Caroline Steele recently, Hungry City. There's a very interesting map which showed the supply chain of ancient Rome, this is 100 AD, and this is under a section of the book which was There Was No Golden Age of Local. So the Romans, 2,000 years ago, they got their oysters from London, they got their ketchup, they call it liquamen, from southern Spain, and all their grain came from the north of Africa. Very important to keep these supply chains open. This is clearly not local. So would you like to, would each of you actually could just unpack this word a bit? Why is this idea of local so important for your organisations?
So the way we've framed it is a celebration of local and seasonal produce. And so what I think there has been a shift globally towards kind of this global market. It's similar to what you were talking about with sushi, where everyone wants to eat the same thing in this and diets are essentially aspirational. So we aspire to new foods and what other people have, and we all want that. So you want to be able to have access to everything in your diet. And so that's driven this global kind of system which has kind of perpetuated that. And so I think there's been this shift away from that to back to kind of the idea of local as we've seen some of the impacts. I think the challenge is that there's also science that says actually just having everything within 25 miles, 50 miles isn't always best. And so that's why we've framed it around celebrating what's local and seasonal. Seasonality, I think, is something that we do not appreciate. We want to be able to have things all year round that we enjoy, even though that's not the way the food system works. That seasonally we should be eating different things. And so we encourage people to think seasonally in the way that they're engaging. And then locally, we want to celebrate the local dishes that are grown in that part of the world and in a way. And this is a conversation, we were talking about lamb, and is it better to use New Zealand lamb in the UK than to grow lamb in the UK? I think the challenge is really, it's actually a question of how much lamb should we be eating if we're in the UK. If it's not meant to a local, yes, you can grow it, but is that the best way to do it? And so I think sometimes we look at these questions in the wrong way, and it goes back to that kind of waterbed issue in a way that I kind of think, we solve one problem by saying it should all be local, which cuts our carbon emissions and cuts these, but at the same time it creates other issues because the amount of inputs we have to put in to grow that piece of food is probably unsustainable, and it could be grown in a better location. So as the Romans did, grain in North Africa makes more sense than them trying to grow it somewhere else, So those kinds of things, I think local needs to be seen as we all live on this planet. How do we bring things around places that...
You hinted at a little bit at diet shifts there and diet changes, behavioural changes there. I think we're going to come back to that. How about the SRA? How do you look at local?
I mean, it's difficult to kind of make statements that are always true about should we eat local food, right? I think it's a guide, it's a signpost. It probably tells you that we should put Fiji water in room 101 if we're sitting here in the Isle of Wight. I think that, if you're asking, is New Zealand lamb better because it's 5 times more carbon efficient than the lamb we get in the UK, I'd sort of say that's the kind of right answer to the wrong question. Because the implicit question there is, how do we all eat lamb everywhere, regardless of season and regardless of geography? And I think these maps, I mean, the Romans started it. The British Empire did a pretty good job of kind of globalizing food and putting like tea from China and sugar from Jamaica in every land labourer's daily diet in the 17th century. I think the issue we've got now is scale, and we think that it's really important, if we're going to protect this planet we all care about, that the idea of having a breakfast with the produce from 4 continents becomes about as trendy as some of the other ideas of colonialism that we've sort of moved past.
Yeah. We've got questions are rolling in for you. I mean, I've got so many to ask you, but I suppose we should give the online audience a chance. So let's just do one more, or a couple of questions before I want to go to see what's going on downstairs as well. So I think this refers to what you were saying earlier, Andrew. Is eating out a better option than cooking at home? If you care about the environment, society, does cooking in bulk offer some advantages over cooking for just a few people, a family?
Sure. So I think particularly a lot of places in Asia, cities such as Hong Kong and Taipei, are showing that there's tremendous amount of scale of economy, certainly in terms of energy use and kind of last mile and production and food waste. In general, restaurants waste a lot less food than we do at home. A lot of the 7 million tonnes of food waste that we incur every year here in the UK happen in our houses. So I think you can rely on restaurants to achieve, and eating out to achieve a lot of things. There's a lot of efficiency there. I think one of the challenges around, I guess, is it better, is restaurants have a lot to pay for. They pay increasingly high rents in our cities. They have increasingly high energy bills. As living wage emerges and wages go up, restaurants are squeezed in margin, and a relatively small proportion of the price that you're paying for your sourdough and poached eggs on avocado is actually going on those ingredients. So I think that's the big challenge for restaurants, is that how do they have the right conversation with human food citizens, people like us, so that they can protect what's important in those ingredients to make sure that they're better or as good as eating at home, as well as doing all the other stuff that they do so well.
Great. Why don't we go back to the Diff Kitchen and see what's going on down there? Vicky and Justin, are you there?
We are.
We are. Lots going on. Salivating. Us in our live studio here, salivating at all the food that Justin's making. What's going on?
Well, we've been following through on your conversation about local and celebration of local and seasonal ingredients. We've been making our gnocchi dough, which comes from locally Isle of Wight grown pumpkins we have. And yeah, so it's been fascinating what you guys have been talking about, and how the Chef's Manifesto, as well as the SRA, are sort of working towards very similar goals. The 10 points that the SRA have, and the 8 thematic areas that the manifesto, which I have a copy of here, works through. And I've actually designed this 3-course meal covering quite a lot of the different points we have in the manifesto. Also, talking about restaurants.
Yeah. So, absolutely. You were about to launch, and you're doing loads of stuff in the food space, a restaurant. So, what's the story?
Well, following on from Tiny Leaf, which I don't know if anyone has heard about, we launched about 3 years ago in Notting Hill as a pop-up concept. It was a sort of a answer to the food waste pandemic that Paul and Nick were speaking about earlier. That I just kind of rather disenchanted with the amount of waste that I was seeing in restaurants, and I want to do something a little bit different. So I spoke with some of our suppliers who I realised were wasting, a lot of vegetables, like bananas that had 1 or 2 black dots on them. They were throwing them all in the bin. So we took all their wonky and weird fruit and vegetables off them and opened a very large pop-up in London's Notting Hill, which went very well. So we had by taking would-be waste, turn it into sort of casual fine dining, and then sending all that, any bits we had left to get biodigested. So
was that sort of local to the area, the biodigester?
The guy was just within London.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then that's where my new restaurant
came from. What's the story with the new restaurant? What's the name?
That's called sativa, which comes from the Latin for cultivated. A lot of the crops that we are going to be eating are going to be grown inside the restaurant.
Yeah. Wow. So how are you doing that?
We are going to be having a 22,000 square foot vertical farm inside the restaurant that's powered by the food waste. We have a biodigester and a hydrogen fuel cell technology that powers the restaurant, and we capture our carbon emissions and feed them to the plants, and we have a few different circular economies running within that.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. And so how's the preparation going? What's your...
Well, we just launched our test kitchen about 2 months ago, Sativa Test Kitchen. You can see us on Instagram or online, sativa-restaurant.com. And we're trying out new recipes, working with new partners. We've built a smaller version of the restaurant in our test kitchen over in Kensington. We're going to be having a biodigester in there as well. And yeah, working with all the local producers and hopefully growing some of our own produce downstairs.
And when can we eat the food?
Well, that's available now. You can come down next week.
Amazing.
But the restaurant should be opening next summer in King's Cross.
Yeah, amazing. Have we got any other questions coming in, Nick, from the online audience?
We have a few questions. I don't know whether it's suitable for Justin. There's a question here says, there seems to be something a bit elitist with eating the right food, whether that's ethical, clean, local, artisanal. How do we get over that?
I think, that working with a hyper-local supply chain, I think, and you can bring the cost down. That's what we're aiming to do with our next venture, or in this venture. So if you can make it more accessible and affordable, then you can pass that on to your customer. I don't see why it has to be elitist. I mean, organic food has been, because it has taken more to get the licenses and stuff from the bodies that grant organic licenses. But I think that there will be the more people get on board with it, it will bring the prices down. Great.
It feels like as well. So sort of hearing some of the stats talking about earlier, how much people eat out. That in certain parts of the world, it's something that just everyone does because they don't have maybe a kitchen at home or that equipment. But people are eating out more and more here too. Is that a trend that you're seeing? We
have seen. There were some of the stats we've been doing, especially from companies like Deliveroo, etc. How the increase in people that are getting on board and ordering food to be restaurant food delivered to their home. And also with the plant-based one has been increased by about 1,000% or 987%, I think it was in the last year with Deliveroo.
As in plant-based
food being delivered
in the UK.
Yeah.
Wow.
In the UK. So there's a big rise in conscious dining.
Okay, yeah. I actually did my first Deliveroo order last week.
How was it?
Yeah, it was delicious.
Excellent. It's not quite as hot and quite as ready as you get in the restaurant there.
No, but I mean, I normally live on a farm on the Isle of Wight, so it was exciting for me being able to get something to... I mean, some of these eggs actually I was saying earlier, plucked out of a chicken this morning.
Oh, brilliant.
So very fresh, very local.
Well, good with the seasonal... if you eat with the seasons, you get the benefit of all the nutrients as well, like the squashes we have here. Very high in vitamin A, vitamin E, and lots of beta-carotene, alpha-carotene, and another one which I can't remember the name of, which is very beneficial as well.
And so I guess in your restaurant everything's seasonal. What's the percentage of stuff you're going to be kind of growing there?
We're going to be growing about 60 to 70%.
On site? On
site, yes. Wow. So we're not just be growing leafy greens like a lot of we're having an aeroponic system, which will be growing cucumbers, melons, tomatoes, lots of vine things, peas, beans, and then Chinese cabbage, ruby chard, wasabi, and lots of different spices, peppers and chilies, and then obviously all the herbs as well, the basils, the bays, the thymes, etc., and all of those things.
And is this something, do you think we're going to see more of in sort of popping up in restaurants everywhere?
That is the plan, yes. A lot of people are taking it on board now. There's a few companies doing the little box systems where you can grow in fridges. Yeah. But now I've spoken with about seven or eight different companies in the last few months who are wanted to integrate it into their restaurants.
Really cool. So what's happening next? What are we going to do?
Well, we're about to put this on if the water's boiling. That's perfect. So here we have our first batch of gnocchi going in. So you've got to cook them until they float to the top, which means they're ready, and then we shall get them in the pan.
So this is something we should all be cooking at home?
Definitely. Seasonal, perfect. Seasonal, so it's made from potato and pumpkin. Or you can use other gourds as squash. Butternut squash, which is quite popular in the UK. Just keep it eating with the seasons. Keeps all the nutritional benefits within that. So popped into a very well-known supermarket 2 days ago just to try out one of the recipes, get some pumpkins. Didn't have any at all. I mean, a huge supermarket. I was like, you don't have any? I said, but they're in season. They said, I know. They said, well, you can have some strawberries, which are completely out of season. It's crazy that they don't work with the seasons. They're much more easy and beneficial. That's one of the reasons, problem with the broken food system we have at the moment. Not eating, as Paul was saying, whether it's more sustainable to be eating fruit from another country sometimes it is, but most of the time, especially with fruit and veg, it's pretty beneficial to be eating local.
And as a consumer, sometimes it's hard to kind of figure out, as they were talking about lamb from New Zealand, yes, it might be grass-fed, or, it's hard to figure out some of these things. So how do you do that in a restaurant, kind of match up what you decide to
Well, because we don't really work with animals, so we're all plant-based, mostly, about 90% plant-based. We use some butters and dairies, but our dairy we use comes from within the M25. There's a great dairy farm there called Ahimsa, which is zero slaughter and zero insemination. So they're very conscious on how they treat their livestock, and they're all looked after. And
amazing. I feel like I'm going to have to go and visit.
Yeah, it's literally 10 minutes from, on the train. It's about half an hour drive from central London.
Yeah, cool. Well, we better get back to cooking, and we'll shortly be bringing the food back up to the studio so everyone can have it. Well, not everyone, but you guys in the studio can have a taste.
Over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky and Justin. It looks very yummy and wholesome down there. We're really looking forward to trying some of the produce. You might have noticed or sort of heard Justin mention circular economy in his description of the Sativa restaurants. I work for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and we try to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. We've been looking at the circular economy principles this year, designing out waste and pollution, keeping products, materials in use, and regenerating natural systems, and applying that to city food systems. Andrew, Paul, and Justin are part of that consortium. We are going to be launching a report in January, so look out for that. Andrew, you had some comment to make about the elitist question earlier.
Yeah, I guess just to point out, in case it's not obvious to people, that sustainable food is cheaper than unsustainable food. The more we price in the externalities of our broken food system, the wider that gap's going to get. I think that if you're eating seasonally, you're eating when there's abundance and when the prices are coming down. If you're eating plant-based meals and plant-based proteins, you're eating some of the kind of cheaper end of the ingredient list. If you're looking at carcass balance of animals and you're eating some of the lesser known cuts and the things that get wasted, then that's the best bargains to be had in our animal protein world.
But that requires education, though, people to know what to do with those kind of things, because they
sure.
can be a little bit intimidating when you're presented with a gizzard or a neck or something.
I guess that's another form of elitism, but I guess if we just look at economic elitism, sustainable food is cheaper than unsustainable food.
Yeah. So that is, I think you've answered this question, because there's a really good question coming in from Jesus Pagan at Foodtopia. They're a food NGO that operate down in Murcia. He says, if all the food costs were internalised in its market price, the average family could not afford it. This is the real cause of our crisis. Do you disagree with that? How can we keep food prices low while at the same time paying the real cost for food? Do you think you've answered that?
I think it depends on the family's diet, and I think if they're eating beef every day, then there's a truth in that. If it's closer to the diet of the Indian subcontinent for the last 2,000 years, I think we're going to be just fine.
Yeah.
Can I just say on that, look, there is some really interesting thinking around that. I mean, generally, globally, food is too cheap in the majority of the world. So I would actually say food is ridiculously cheap here. In terms of amount of our disposable income that we spend on food in places like the UK, it's crazy. The World Food Programme did a cost of the plate of food where they looked at a simple bowl of beans and they said, what would that cost in different locations as a proportion of income? And so they were basically saying people's incomes are different around the world, but let's look at these just core ingredients and how much of one person's income that would take to make. So it's this bowl of soup. And so in New York City, it was something like $1.99. In South Sudan, it was $360, something like that. You can look it up on WFP. But basically what that's saying is that there's parts of the world where people are using significantly more of their income to actually purchase the food they need every day. And then there's other parts of the world which are getting food very cheap. And there's actually a bit of subsidization that goes on in that system. And so I think this is something that we do need to look at. And I think part of it is also, if food prices went up, we'd be much more thoughtful about what we threw out, about how we wasted food, about eating too much. you would eat far less, smaller portions, all these kinds of things. So it could have a health benefit. I think some of the broken parts of our system are actually tied to that.
But I heard on the food chain recently, but they did a special on food and dictators, that part of the reason that Mubarak was overcome is was overthrown. Sorry, was because bread prices went up in the city,
Of course.
which he was keeping artificially low in the countryside. So this is a good time for this question. What role can governments then play in the issues that have been considered in this session, waste, nutrition, and the sort of the food price issue, without coming across as Big Brother? There's a question from Joe.
Yeah, so I think governments can play a key role. I mean, everyone needs to play a role in food systems, but food, as you mentioned as we opened, is one of the biggest impacts here. And yet it's the wild, wild west in some ways, you know. And so I think governments have to play a role, and food should be something. I mean, there is different schools of thought around food being almost a human right, that everyone should have access to it, that food should be something that, you know, why do we have people without enough food in a world when we actually have enough food? I mean, and what role does governments play in this? There has been conversations around food being used as a weapon of war. And can you then take people to the criminal tribunal and actually because people are using famine as a weapon of war, and that's part of the challenge. So I think the role governments can play is really helping support access, support affordability, support the, so in looking at smallholder farmers, for example, one of the big challenges is we need innovation. We need to think about how we learn about growing a diversity of foods. At the moment, a lot of the research has gone into the big five, you know, the big crops, soy and, you know, wheat, and the big crops that have provided calories for the population. What we need to do is now diversify that, because we know that diversification is something that will help mitigate climate shocks, will mitigate some of the other diet issues that we have. And so I think there needs to be a lot more work put on innovation of how are we growing these crops in different ways, and there is governments that are doing that. Places like the Netherlands are doing amazing things in the food system. And then there's also the delivery mechanisms, and there's the government can play a role in that, in helping to ensure that food is getting to the right places and the distribution across there. And then there's also the data side. So I think one of the things we often don't do is measure progress. And if we don't know what works and we don't have data around it, it's very hard for us to then be able to invest in sustainable ways. So we can't then make sure that the money that governments are spending to support subsidisation and other things are doing so with the maximum benefit.
Yeah. I guess, to say it as simply as I can, I think there's a couple of key agendas for government around kind of progressive incentivisation of the right forms of production and the right forms of consumption. So if you look at where we are now in a lot of countries, we're a long way away from that. And I guess government is chiefly involved in being an almost subsidisation and marketing agency for its country's exports, which are fueling some of the broken bits of our food system. Here in the UK, I don't know if you noticed, but our government's quite busy at the moment, but there's some really interesting conversations going on around how we can change the kind of, farming subsidies that basically exist to protect the status quo into be kind of progressive in terms of the production patterns and rewarding for conservation and biodiversity growth as well as yield. And ditto on the consumption side, I think, representing the kind of member businesses that are part of the SRA, it's a problem that it's no cheaper or more advantageous to open a kind of community-led sustainable cafe than it is a fried chicken shop next to a school. Yeah. They pay the same business rates, they pay the same VAT. They are subject to exactly the same taxation system. So the governments that are holding on to the kind of agenda around health and community need to find a way to be pulling that through into the business conditions they're creating for small businesses in particular.
Yeah, I'm glad. That sort of reminds me a little bit of I think it's one of your commandments. You talk about we need to use ingredients. No, sorry, not commandments, sorry. The guidelines, whatever. Ingredients grown with respect for the earth. Dan Barber tells a very nice story about how when he was developing his farm, he needed to use goats to sort of clear some of the thorny shrub around the fields, and then he needed to put some nitrogen in the soil, so he had to plant rye. And things like goats and rye weren't things he usually used, but it was almost as if the farm was leading what then the menu, the farm dictated the menu.
Yep.
So can you just tell me, this ingredients grown with respect to the earth? It sounds a little bit like regenerative farming, or can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, just a couple of examples, I guess. You know, things like peas and clover are really important in food systems and agricultural systems that are trying to use less imported nutrients from outside, if they're trying to close the loop and be a bit kind of lower impact. They're both crops that can fix nitrogen in the soil. So you want to plant them as a kind of fallow year crop on your main one. So a really practical thing that chefs and restaurants can do is build a market for those ingredients, because if farmers are not just doing that to restore the soil, but they're in themselves a crop, then we kind of move into a kind of slightly better place in terms of that, I guess, farm influencing what goes on menus. You could look at a similar case for things like kind of baby kid goat meat, which, you know, in certain parts of the world is popular. In the UK, it's way more economically advantageous to kind of take the milk, not give it to the baby goat, and make goat's cheese. And so there's a sort of structural waste of male baby goats. There's some fantastic businesses we work with here in the UK that are, I guess, pointing at that sort of another way of looking at food waste, and then making menus and dishes that celebrate that.
I think this is one of the many, this idea of ingredients grown with respect to the earth is one of the many places where our three, if we want to call them manifestos, intersect. Because you have that in your in your chef's manifesto as well. Could you maybe tell me what you mean by that? But can you sort of tell a story through the smallholder farmer? Because the smallholder farmer seems to be a really important player in this future.
So I mean, one of the examples that I find the most interesting is from India, where there's a number of different partners working with smallholder farmers that used to traditionally grow certain grains that were very specific to that area. And these grains are grains that are from the millet family they use 1/5 of the water that rice does. And so if you can think of India, densely populated, using less water has got to be a good thing. And so, but they also have high nutrient properties, and they can be substituted in. Now, for a variety of reasons, farmers stopped growing them because the market wasn't there. So farmers respond to market, even if they know what their farm needs. And so there's this kind of two-way. What we found in India, there's a group called Original Indian Table, which is a business venture that's basically working to help provide market and the bridge between the smallholder farmer and the chefs. And then there's a group of chefs. There's a Young Chefs Association of India, and they have 100+ chefs that are working, and they have sometimes multiple restaurants. So one of the chefs, Anahita, who has been really involved in the Chef's Manifesto, she has 8 or 9 restaurants, 27. She really champions these millets and brings them in and starts to tell a story about this grain that's grown with respect. And so it closes that link, and the chef provides that linkage between the smallholder farmer and the consumer, providing and presenting the ingredient in a way that's accessible, but also educating people about that and the benefits of it. And as soon as people start to see that, then what happens is they start to show interest in the farm. They start to say, how does that work? And so to me, on that smallholder side, I think those kinds of relationships need to exist, because, you know, we say sometimes farmers should do this or they should do that, but at the same time, they've got to survive. And you know, as Andrew said, the amount of money we're willing to pay sometimes for those ingredients is very low. So it's something where we've got to come up with a system and almost like a circularity that does connect and provide a livelihood at the same time.
And through this, is there a resilience angle here as well? I know that a lot of Indian farmers are at the front end of climate change. Yeah. There's many tragedies you hear about smallholder farmers, but by creating these different, say, agroecological farming systems, you build strength of soil, you need less water, you get more resilient farming,
Absolutely.
If we can educate chefs, then they can create the demand that helps smallholder farmers do the stuff that they know kind of benefits their land, right? And I think that's where we really align is on the power of chefs to kind of simplify some of these complex issues and bring it out in delicious plates of food. So
Chefs have a real
we've
important role in that, yeah.
we've been running oneplanetplate.org, which is a kind of free campaign for chefs to get involved with. I think you guys can pop that up on the screen for people. There's in case you're getting hungry, there's 1,500 recipes on there that are, I guess, chefs doing exactly that and taking local ingredients, maybe wider varieties, heritage varieties, and putting that on the menu. And I think if we all can play a part in this, if we can start going into restaurants and eating more consciously and thinking, yes, I want to eat at a sustainable restaurant, but I also want to choose something on the menu that I know is, I guess, the most sustainable dish on there, then the kind of wheels of capitalism start clicking in the right direction.
Great. Yeah, we will make sure we'll get those 1,500 recipes up in the comments area after this session. More questions coming in from the online audience. As you are experts, I'd love to know what you eat at home versus restaurants, plant-based or otherwise. Will you still be able to eat your favourite dish in 20 years? Maybe we'll start with Paul.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, our diet's very much shifted over time. We still do eat meat, and we do eat a variety. I would say our eating style is plant-forward. We tend to enjoy, so we'll enjoy fish, we'll enjoy meat, and when we go out, often we'll indulge slightly, and that's, I think, common for people, is that, you know, if they are eating a plant-forward diet, they often will prioritize that when they go out for a treat or something like that. And so we've dramatically reduced though, because the proteins, we're starting to use much more holistic ingredients, whole grains, and so, you know, we will eat a range of different things that we didn't eat. It used to be you always built your whole meal around what piece of meat are you going to eat, and you then put a few vegetables. What we've been increasingly doing is shifting that thinking to actually be thinking through other ingredients and the role that they play, and ensuring that our plate is incredibly diverse. And I think in 20 years, the reality is, I think for many parts of the world, I think meat will be essentially seen as a small addition to a plate or a dish rather than the main part. And so I think dishes will be created without meat, maybe with a garnish of something on the top, if at all.
Sounds like Dan Barber's third plate. Same question to you, Andrew.
Yeah, expert, but also greedy human. I'm an omnivore like the rest of us. I tried eating no mammals for a year, and that was kind of an interesting experiment. I think if you're looking at kind of single interventions you can make that kind of align well around, I guess, still giving yourself a range of delicious things to eat, but also a kind of environmentally positive diet. That's a good one to think about. You still allow birds in there and a bit of dairy. I think, you know, I'm lucky enough to eat out in a lot of restaurants. They're our customers and our members, so to some extent I eat whatever chef tells me to. But at home, I like cooking plant-based dishes, and I tend to avoid red meat when I'm eating out, because I think it's a tough sell for a lot of restaurants to be doing all the right things there.
Yeah. Processed food. Do you have a view on processed food? We did a little bit of research as part of our Cities and Circular Economy food project, and a lot of food ingredients go through processed food. It seems like, I understand in the UK, 50% of the food purchases are ultra-processed food. Does processed food have a role in the future of food? Does one of you want to?
This is something so in looking at hungry people around the world and how do we feed everyone, there is this kind of interesting ethical dilemma in some ways I see, where it's very easy to kind of have approaches that say, well, we should all have smallholder versus large, you know, and we should have it this way or processed or not. If you're hungry and you need the calories to keep alive and keep your child alive, you'll feed them whatever you can feed them. But long term, there's also the right way to do that and the wrong way. And so what I suppose I would say is that personally, we try and eat as little processed food as we can. At times, it's convenient when you're traveling, sometimes where you don't have access to something. Generally speaking, though, my view is that a lot of the food challenges we have around issues around nutrients is because we're not eating whole foods. Somebody was explaining to me the other day that if you eat a can of processed crisps, like a Pringles or something, you eat that, you can eat that whole thing and still feel to get the same sort of number of calories, you'd have to eat like 12 potatoes. And you probably can't eat 12 potatoes. And there's a kind of a connection there about how much you can actually get, take on processed versus unprocessed. And that, I think, has an impact on our calorie intake.
Yeah. My feeling is that that's where the money is to be made. We're talking about the margins are really low these days. That is the way that food brands can turn cheap commodity crops into profitable packaged food. And that's why there's so much of it. But do you have a view on processed food?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to kind of create a brand out of broccoli, right?
Yeah, it's difficult to make money from whole food, from good food.
Yeah, yeah. And I think at a restaurant level, one of the challenges of cooking with much more fresh produce is about the level of skills that you need in the kitchen, the amount of time you then need and equipment, and I guess the potential to increase food waste if you've got, I don't know if you've noticed, but we're not very loyal in our eating out habits. Sometimes we don't even know where we're going to go in an hour and a half, yet somehow the chef's supposed to know how to predict exactly how many people are coming through the door. So I think, it's another one of these waterbed things. I think a lot of food is wasted in the kind of out-of-home section of the economy and the food system because we're trying to cook with more fresh ingredients and we're trying to cope with that kind of uncertainty. Yeah, I guess it's interesting, if you look at, I guess the sharp end of this agenda is really about the kind of flexitarian and meat reduction trends that we're seeing all over the world. And there's kind of two alternative camps about how we deal with, I guess, the need to reduce the amount of meat we're eating as a global society and how we kind of cope with that in terms of our food patterns and our food desires. And one is the kind of invasion of technology and processing, and the other is about, I guess, sort of simple plant protein. And I think we can see which way the venture capital is going for exactly that reason, because it's easier to put a bag and a label on it. I think they've probably both got a role to play. I think processing isn't inherently evil. There's probably some sort of pretty bad ways of processing food, and there's some less bad in terms of, I guess, its role in a circular economy as well as in a food system.
I've got some nice whiffs of smells coming from this direction. Maybe this is time to bring Justin in.
Hi. Wow, that's what you can make from one pumpkin.
Incredible. Can you squeeze up there?
Squeeze up.
Oh, incredible.
Can I sit on the sofa? No, you're right. I can squat. I squat. It's nice. Is there space?
Well, can you make it work?
We'll make it work.
So, Justin, is it just about eating fresh stuff?
Well, it is, yes. I mean, it's fresh and seasonal, that's where you need to go. And with seasonal, they kind of tie hand in hand. If something is seasonal, it's local to you. Oh, sorry, local as well. Local, seasonal, and then you get the freshness as well. There's not many air miles travelling from Brazil or wherever it has come from. So this is all seasonal from the island.
Yeah. Can you describe what you've cooked today?
So this all comes from one pumpkin. We have the pumpkin gnocchi here with local sage leaves from one of your team's garden this morning. Then we made the pumpkin. I made this first, actually. I made the pumpkin mousse. And it's got crisp candied pumpkin skins on top with some of the seeds, which we've also used in the salad here. So we've got pumpkin salad with some of the local kale. We've toasted the seeds from the pumpkin, dehydrated the skins, and we've got some local fennel on top as well.
Incredible.
Pretty good.
Thank you so much. I think it's time to wrap up because I'm getting hungry and I need to eat. So can I just finish by thanking my guests, Andrew Stephen from the Sustainable Restaurant Association, Paul Newman from the SDG2 Advocacy Hub, and Justin Horn from Tiny Leaf and Sativa in the Future. Thank you, Justin, for this. If you enjoyed this session, we have a veritable larder of food for the mind in the other areas of the DIF. We've done a number of food sessions this year, and so just search for food on the DIF website. All it leaves for me to say is thank you for joining us, and please tune in again soon. Bye-bye.